Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we tell the complete story of Zul'jin, Warlord of the Amani and Overlord of all forest trolls, a warrior who lost an eye to his enemies, cut off his own arm to escape them, and spent his entire life trying to reclaim a homeland that had been taken from his people thousands of years before he was even born. There is a moment somewhere in the darkened forests east of what humans call the Hillsbrad foothills that explains everything you need to know about Zul'jin. He is chained to a crumbling pillar. His right eye has been gouged out. The rangers who captured him have stepped back momentarily as a rescue assault crashes into the surrounding camp from the tree line. His own warriors, who tracked the far striders across miles of dark forest to reach him. Amid the chaos of clashing steel and screaming fighters, the warlord reaches out with one scarred hand toward a fallen spear lying in the dirt at his feet. He grabs it. He looks at the chain wrapped around his left arm, and he does what no one who has not already made peace with pure, consuming purpose would ever consider doing. He presses the spear's blade against his own flesh, and he saws until the arm falls away. He stands up. He walks through the fight, one eye gone, one arm gone, bleeding from a wound that would kill most warriors before they reach the tree line. He vanishes into the dark forest with his people. He did not regenerate that arm. He did not regrow that eye. Trolls are capable of both. Their regeneration is legendary, the defining biological trait of the species. The reason veteran soldiers know it is always better to use fire on a troll than to leave him merely wounded and assume he won't be walking again by tomorrow. But Zul'jin walked out of that forest, missing both, and he stayed that way for the rest of his life. He never compensated for them with a prosthetic arm. He never covered the empty socket. He kept both wounds on display, visible to every troll who ever looked up at the warlord of the Amani, and every enemy who ever had the misfortune of standing across from him on a battlefield. Every troll who ever looked at him saw a warlord who had paid that price and come back anyway. Every human or elf who faced him saw a warrior who had experienced that and was still standing, still fighting, still coming forward, still absolutely committed to the thing he had been committed to his entire life. That thing was simple. The land was his people's land. It had been taken from them. He intended to take it back. This is not a story about corruption. Zul'jin never touched demonic power. No old god whispered to him. He was not seduced by darkness or consumed by a curse. He was a man who inherited a wound, passed down through his people across thousands of years, through his ancestors, through the memory of what his civilization had been before newcomers with magic on their side arrived and simply annexed the northeastern forests because they could. He decided to be the one who undid it. He lived for that decision completely, without reservation, without compromise, without the kind of flexibility that might have allowed him to survive. He was magnificent, and he was terrible, and the line between those two things runs directly through a history that the people who called him a villain preferred not to discuss when deciding who was right. This is his story, but to tell his story, you have to go back a very long way. He looked like what he was. The physical descriptions that survive in World of Warcraft's lore and in the game itself present a troll of extraordinary size, even by the standards of his own people. Forest trolls run large, but Zul'jin was notable even among them. The height, the build, the tattooed face beneath the empty eye socket, the stump where the left arm had been. All of it added up to a visual impression that was unmistakable. He wore the evidence of his life's cost on his body without concealment, and the effect on anyone who saw him was exactly what he intended. Here is a being who has absorbed enormous damage and is still moving forward with complete conviction. Deal with that as you will. The axe that he carried in his right hand was not enchanted or divinely blessed. It was a good troll axe, well maintained and well used, and the fact that he wielded it with one arm, compensating for the missing left through a fighting style adapted over years of practice, was itself a statement. He had taken everything the world had given him and built a version of himself out of it that was still functional, still dangerous, still pointed at the thing he had been pointed at since before any of the people he was fighting were born. The world before the sundering, before the cataclysm that shattered the original supercontinent of Kalimdor into the scattered land masses that Azeroth's peoples would later name and inhabit, was a different kind of world. The vast continent that covered most of the globe's eastern face was old in ways that later civilizations could barely comprehend. Empires had risen and fallen there before humans existed, before the Night Elves had achieved sentience, before any of the races that would later dominate Azeroth's politics had drawn their first breath. The Trolls were among the oldest of those empires. There were two great troll powers in the ancient eastern continents. To the south, centering on the steaming jungles where ley lines pooled into dense magical fog, the Gurubashi Empire stretched across the coastal lowlands and river valleys. Their city, Zul'Gurub, rose on stone foundations laid so long ago that even the Gurubashi themselves had lost count of the generations. To the east and north, in the forests, in the hills, in the river valleys that cut through the interior highlands, the Amani held sway. Not one tribe with a single king, but a loose confederation of forest troll clans bound together by shared language, shared religious practice, shared identity. The city at the center of that identity, the place all of them considered their spiritual and political capital, was Zul'Aman. Above both empires, in the traditional hierarchy of troll civilization, sat the Zandalari, the oldest troll empire, the most intellectually sophisticated, the keepers of lineage and recorded history. They lived on a high plateau that would one day become the island continent of Zandalar and maintained loose authority over all the troll peoples. They were the elders. When important decisions needed to be made, when crises threatened the troll peoples as a whole, the Zandalari were the ones who came with authority to convene and organize a response. The ancient world the trolls inhabited was not peaceful. The old gods, vast imprisoned entities of cosmic corruption who slumbered in chains beneath Azeroth's crust, had servants in the world, creatures of varying power who served their incomprehensible agendas. The most dangerous of these were the aqir, insectoid creatures, ancient and organized, who did not share the world and did not intend to. Their armies moved across the continent with the focused efficiency of creatures that viewed all organic life either as resources to consume or territory to purge. The aqir targeted the troll empires specifically, perhaps because the trolls were the most numerous and powerful mortal presence on the continent, perhaps because the old gods' corruption ran deepest in the places where the Loas, the troll animal spirits, exercised their divine attention. Whatever the reason, the war that followed was enormous, a conflict that spanned the breadth of the continent and lasted for generations, the aqir striking from multiple directions, the trolls marshaling every fighter they could spare, and still finding the enemy numerous enough to require constant vigilance. The Zandalari called for unity. All troll peoples, all clans, all factions, set aside whatever petty conflicts existed between them and faced the aqir together as one force. The Amani answered that call. Alongside the Gurubashi and the Zandalari, they hunted the aqir across the land, driving the swarms back from troll settlements, cutting off supply lines, burning nests, forcing the insectoid armies into progressively smaller and more desperate positions. The war culminated with the pursuit of a Seathrax, an aqir commander of cosmic significance, a servant of the old gods powerful enough to level a city with direct application of its will. Its name was Kithix. The combined troll armies ran it to ground after years of campaign, and in a battle that must have been unlike anything that came before or after in that age, they killed it. A being of genuine cosmic power, a servant of entities that predated the ordering of the universe, brought down by troll spears and troll determination and the weight of numbers and the sustained fury of a people fighting for their existence. Where Kithix fell, they built something to mark it. Over time, that marker became a settlement. The settlement became a village. The village became a town, then a complex, then a city that sprawled across the terrain in layers, upper temples in the curved organic stonework that characterized Amani architecture, lower levels becoming mazes as generations built atop generations, the foundations of the earliest construction growing stranger and more labyrinthine as centuries piled upon centuries. They called it Zul'Aman, and it was not merely a city. It was a monument to the first great victory, a statement carved in stone above the buried remains of a god creature, saying plainly, "We were here, we killed what tried to consume us, and this is our land." Zul'Aman, in its height, was a city of genuine grandeur, though it was nothing like the soaring spires of elven architecture or the monumental marble constructions of later human kingdoms. It was organic or earthy, built in harmony with the forest rather than imposed upon it. The great stonework towers of the central temple complex rose from bedrock, layered with 16,000 years of accumulated significance, their surfaces carved with the stylized animal forms of the loa, the sinuous curve of the lynx, the spread wings of the dragonhawk, the broad-haunched weight of the bear, the sharp-taloned reach of the eagle. Between the buildings, the ancient trees of the northeastern forest grew right up to the walls, and in some places through them, roots cracking foundations that had been laid in a different age. The priests maintained this coexistence deliberately. The forest was not an obstacle to be cleared. It was the thing Zul'Aman existed within. The city's inner sanctums were places of fire and animal spirit. Braziers burned in the shapes of claws and beaks. The smell of blood and incense moved through the corridors on the same currents of air. Priests in elaborate headdresses representing the great Loas conducted the ceremonies that had structured Amani life since the founding, not as historical reenactment, but as living practice, the covenants renewed with every performed ritual. The animal spirits maintained an active relationship with the people who honored them. The great central fire that burned in Zul'Aman's deepest sanctum was said to have been lit from the sparks struck when Kithix fell, and whether that was literally true or not, the Amani treated it as true, which made it function as true in the context of their civilization. The Loa, the animal spirits the Amani revered, the great primal powers of bear and eagle and lynx and dragonhawk, were worshipped in Zul'Aman's sanctums. Priests maintained the covenants between the Amani and their gods. Warriors went into battle with Loa blessings. Children were initiated into the relationship with the divine through ceremonies that had been performed in the same forms for longer than any living troll could trace back. The connection between the Amani and their animal spirits was not simply religious sentiment. It was the foundation of their identity, their culture, their sense of what they were and why they mattered. The Amani warrior tradition that developed over those thousands of years was built around the same relationship. Fighters did not go to war as isolated individuals seeking personal glory. They went as representatives of their clan and their covenant. The Loa's blessing was sought before a campaign. The Loa's attention was maintained through the conduct of the fight, and the aftermath of battle was processed through ceremony that reported back to the divine what had been done in its name. An Amani warrior who broke the covenant, who fought dishonorably, who killed in ways that violated the Loa's expectations, who ignored the forms, was not simply a bad soldier. He was a spiritual problem, and the priests would deal with him as such. The forest itself was inseparable from all of this. The northeastern woodlands that the Amani inhabited were ancient, dense, and crossed by river systems that made navigation for outsiders profoundly difficult. The Amani knew every trail, every seasonal ford, every place where the undergrowth opened into clearings that could serve as staging points for an ambush, every ridge from which a scout could watch a valley's full length without being seen. This knowledge was not simply tactical, it was spiritual. The forest was the Loa's domain, and knowing the forest was knowing the Loa. Moving through it correctly, quietly, with awareness of what it contained, was a practice with both military and religious dimensions. This is the culture that Zul'jin was born into, a people of extraordinary depth and continuity, grounded in a history that stretched back to before most of Azeroth's later civilizations could claim a beginning, living in a city built on the bones of a cosmic enemy they had killed together, worshipping animal gods who had been in covenant with them for as long as memory reached. And all of it overshadowed, from a very long time before Zul'jin was born, by the presence of Silvermoon on the horizon and the gleaming barrier that kept the Amani out of their own ancient forests. Zul'Aman stood for thousands of years in this form, the beating heart of the Amani people, the monument to their ancient victory, the center of their relationship with the divine. Then the elves arrived, roughly 6,800 years before the dark portal opened and the orcish horde came pouring through, a date that lands in the middle of an age so remote from the events of World of Warcraft that most players never think much about it. A fleet of ships appeared on the eastern coast of the Eastern Kingdoms. They called themselves the Highborne. More precisely, they were exiled. Highborne, night elves who had been driven out of their civilization on the far western side of the world by their own queen and their own society for their compulsive use of arcane magic. The night elf hierarchy had decided that arcane magic was dangerous, that the obsessive use of it by the Highborne caste had helped destabilize the well of eternity and contributed to the sundering that shattered the world. The surviving Highborne were ordered to stop practicing magic entirely. They refused. They were exiled. Their leader was a mage lord named Dathremer Sunstrider, a man of considerable arcane knowledge and considerable determination. He had brought what remained of his people onto ships and sailed east with a specific agenda: find a ley line nexus, a place where multiple currents of magical energy converged and pooled, sufficient to anchor a new civilization on a foundation of arcane power that could replace what the sundering had destroyed. The northeastern forests of the eastern kingdoms had exactly what he needed. The problem was that those forests were not empty. The Amani had lived in those forests for thousands of years. They had hunted in them, worshipped in them, built their villages and their sacred sites in the river valleys and on the hillsides and among the ancient trees. The forests were not a resource waiting to be exploited. They were home, sacred, familiar, inhabited continuously for so long that the Amani did not think of them as territory they held so much as part of what they were. The forests and the Amani were the same thing. One did not exist separately from the other. When the highborn ships came ashore and the night elves began moving inland, the Amani responded as any people would respond to an uninvited armed force marching through their territory. They attacked. Here is where the shape of the next several thousand years was determined. The Highborn used magic, not just combat spells thrown in panic, the deep, sophisticated arcane arts that Dathremer had spent decades studying, the direct manipulation of the ley lines themselves, the application of force in forms that had no natural equivalent and no natural defense. The Amani warriors, trained to fight other warriors, experienced in troll warfare with all its rituals and its rhythms, had no category for what they encountered when elven mages unleashed ley line power against them. Bursts of arcane energy scattered entire formations. Walls of force stopped axe charges cold. Counterattacks of sorcerous precision came from directions no scout was watching. The Amani outnumbered the Highborn by more than 10 to 1. They had military traditions that stretched back to the age of the Aqir War. They had home terrain advantage, intimate knowledge of every trail and river crossing and seasonal ford in those forests. They had the Loa's general favor and the prayers of their priests. None of it was enough because the elves had a category of power that did not respond to any of those advantages. Dathremer found his nexus. He planted his banner on ground the Amani considered among the most sacred in their homeland. He declared the land would henceforth be called Quel'Thalas, High Home, in the Thalassian tongue he was in the process of constructing for his new people. He and his high-born settlers began building. They erected magical fortifications. They raised the Bandinoriel, the gatekeeper, a magical barrier that hummed with such concentrated supernatural force that even trolls who had no direct sensitivity to arcane magic could feel it as wrongness, as an instinctive warning that what lay beyond was not for them. The barrier ran along the boundaries of what Dathremer had claimed. Within it, the Highborn built their towers and their temples and their roads. Without it, the Amani hunted and raged and conducted raids on anyone who strayed beyond its protection. Silvermoon City rose in the heart of Quel'Thalas. Its soaring towers and graceful spires were constructed, stone by stone, on top of ruins that were already ancient. Amani ruins, the remains of settlements and shrines that had been inhabited continuously for millennia before the first elf ever arrived on the eastern coast. The Sunwell, the pool of pure arcane energy that Dathramar created to anchor his new kingdom, was established at the center of a network of ley lines that ran through land the Amani had considered sacred. The Highborne became the High Elves. Their skin, which had been the deep purple of night elven biology, slowly lightened under the Sunwell's influence over generations, taking on the pale gold and warm cream tones that would define the race. Their hair changed, their eye colors shifted from the silver of night elves to the blue and green and teal of their new identity. They were a new people on what was, by any honest accounting, someone else's land. The Amani conducted raids for as long as they had the strength to do so, and then withdrew to Zul'Aman, carrying their fury with them. The barrier kept them out of their own forests. They could reach the elves who ventured beyond Bandanoriel's protection, and they did regularly, making the borderlands genuinely dangerous for any elf without a ranger escort. But they could not reach the heart of what had been taken. They could bleed the elves slowly. They could not undo what had been done. This was the wound. This was the thing that passed down through Amani generations, like a debt that compounded interest with every decade, every century, every 1,000 years, that Silvermoon stood gleaming on the horizon while Zul'Aman crouched in its shadow. The elves had not merely taken territory. They had built their civilization on Amani bones, on Amani shrines, on Amani sacred sites. They had put a magical wall between the Amani and what had been their home, and then they had grown strong behind that wall and called the arrangement of the world natural and just. This is what Zul'jin was born into. Roughly 2,800 years before the Dark Portal, placing these events still in the deep prehistory of the world, as most players of World of Warcraft know it, but in a time that is thoroughly documented in Troll and Elven records. The Amani made the most serious and sustained attempt to reverse what had been done. A chieftain named Jintha, a warrior of the Amani bloodline that would eventually produce Zul'jin, was elevated to lead the largest war host the Amani had assembled in centuries, backed by Zandalari resources and the divine authority the Zandalari could lend to a campaign of this scale. The Zandalari had been watching the Amani's slow diminishment with concern. Quel'Thalas was a wound in the world as they understood it, a foreign civilization built by people who had arrived after the trolls that had now been there long enough to begin looking permanent. If something was going to be done about it, it needed to be done before another millennium passed and the elves' hold became truly unbreakable. The war host that assembled was genuinely enormous. Tens of thousands of warriors from across the Amani Confederation, supplemented by fighters from allied forest troll groups, poured out of Zul'Aman and moved through the forest toward Quel'Thalas. This was not a raid. This was an invasion, an attempt to do in one campaign what 3,000 years of raids had failed to accomplish. Break the elves' hold on the northeastern forests and reclaim what had been taken. The elves, recognizing the scale of what was coming and recognizing with equal clarity that they could not stop it alone, made a desperate alliance. Prince Thoradin of the emerging human kingdom of Erethdor, the man who would become King Thoradin and forge the first human empire, understood that if the Amani broke Quel'Thalas, they would simply continue south into human territory. He offered the elves a deal, alliance in exchange for one thing. The elves would teach 100 humans the arcane arts. This was a decision that the elves could barely bring themselves to make. Arcane magic was theirs, their inheritance, their defining characteristic, what made them what they were. They had never shared it with any other race. They did not particularly want to, but the alternative was facing the Amani host alone, and the host outside their borders was simply too large for any realistic defense. They agreed. 100 humans were taught to weave spells. The decision to share arcane magic with humans was a rupture in how the elves understood themselves. They had spent 6,000 years in Quel'Thalas, treating the arcane arts as their exclusive inheritance, the thing that separated them from every other race, the capability that had allowed Dathramar's exiles to survive and flourish on a continent that had not welcomed them. Diluting that exclusivity, even to 100 students, even under duress, was a concession that cut against the entire architecture of elven identity. Some highborne descended magisters who were present for the decision reportedly argued against it with genuine fury. They were overruled. The reality outside the walls of Silvermoon was too large to be overcome by ideological purity. Thoradin understood the weight of what the elves were giving him. The mages he trained were selected carefully from among those with the most natural affinity for magical instruction, humans who could learn the forms quickly and apply them reliably under battlefield conditions, which were conditions that required different skills than peaceful academic study. He did not have time for a measured curriculum or gentle progression. He had time to teach 100 people enough to be useful in a single large engagement, and the 100 people he chose trained with the understanding that the survival of the elven kingdom, and by extension the security of the human territories further south, depended on what they could do at the end of it. Jintha led the Amani host in the decisive battle with everything they had. The combat was brutal and vast. The Amani fought in the way they had always fought, with numbers, with terrain knowledge, with the stamina of a people fighting for something that had been denied them for 3,000 years. They had come through forest routes the elves had never adequately mapped. They had maintained supply lines across territory they knew better than any elf could claim to know it. Jintha himself commanded from the front, visible to his warriors at all times, his presence in the thick of the fighting, a declaration that this was not a raid to be broken off when the losses mounted, but a war to be fought to the end. And then those 100 human mages acted together in concert, and torrents of fire came down from the sky. The result was catastrophic. Warriors died not individually, but in groups, not in the back and forth of combat, but in waves of annihilating flame. Jintha fell early in the conflagration. The command structure that he represented collapsed with him. The Amani who survived the initial assault looked at what was happening and ran, because there was no strategy available against that kind of destruction. The Troll Wars ended not in a drawn campaign, but in a rout, and the rout ended in the long, bitter retreat back to Zul'Aman. The Amani Empire, which had once been one of the two great powers of the Eastern Kingdoms, never recovered. Zul'Aman remained, the The city was not taken, the Amani tribe was not wiped out, but the territory, the influence, the reach that had characterized the empire at its height were gone. Most forest troll tribes that had been loosely aligned with the Amani accepted the defeat as permanent and scattered, moving away from Quel'Thalas, building lives in new territories, farther east and south, letting the old dream of reclamation fade into myth that older trolls told younger ones around fire pits. The Amani tribe specifically stayed in Zul'Aman and refused to call it finished. The elven blade that proved most lethal to Amani warriors in those conflicts, a rune blade later carried by the Sunstrider dynasty across thousands of years of elven history, earned its title of Troll Killer in the fires of those battles. It was called Fellow Malorn, and the Amani remembered it. After the Troll Wars, the elves of Quel'Thalas had the particular attitude of people who had been proven right. Their use of human mages, the desperate and philosophically uncomfortable decision to share arcane knowledge with a lesser race, as had worked. The troll army that had seemed for a time like it might actually succeed in breaking their kingdom had been annihilated. The lesson that many in Silvermoon drew from this was that innovation, in the face of existential threat, was justified, that the elven hierarchy's willingness to make an uncomfortable concession had saved them, and that this validated their judgment and their position. It did not occur to most of them to think seriously about what they had done to generate the problem in the first place. The Amani threat was treated as an ongoing natural feature of the world, like weather, something that had always existed and would always exist, a hostility that was simply part of the landscape rather than a response to a specific historical action. The fact that the Highborne had arrived on Amani land and established Quel'Thalas on Amani sacred sites was not, in the average Silvermoon resident's moral accounting, considered a cause for the Amani's continued warfare. The Amani were simply dangerous and aggressive, as trolls were, and the elves were simply the civilization that maintained civilization in the northeastern forests, as elves had always done. This comfortable narrative, which required not examining what had been taken, not acknowledging that the Amani had reasons, not confronting the fact that we were here first, was something the Amani could say with complete historical accuracy, was the specific thing that Zul'jin's entire existence argued against. He was the living refusal of the comfortable narrative. His presence on the borderlands, the raids that continued year after year, the name that made Farstrider Rangers tense when the forest moved wrong, all of it was a continuous insistence that the Amani's hostility had a cause that had not been addressed and would not be resolved by military containment. The Amani returned to Zul'Aman carrying an injury that was different in character from the injuries that battle inflicts on bodies. The physical losses, the warriors killed in Jintha's host, the fighters burned by human mage fire, the chieftains and champions who had led the advance and died in the rout, were enormous and grievous. But the injury that persisted in the Amani cultural memory was not primarily about those dead. It was about what their deaths had failed to achieve. Tens of thousands of warriors, the greatest host the Amani had assembled in their history, had marched to the threshold of what needed to be done, and then been burned back by a weapon they had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. The children who were born in Zul'Aman in the generations after the Troll Wars, inherited a particular kind of grief. Their grandparents had been at the gates of Silvermoon. The reclamation had been close enough that its failure felt specifically chosen by the universe, not the ordinary failure of an attempt that was always going to fall short, but the failure of something that had genuinely been possible, derailed by a single catastrophic variable. The fire of 100 human mages, acting in coordination at the worst possible moment, had done what the elves alone could not have done. Without the human alliance, Jintha's host wins. With it, the Amani lose everything. This understanding ran through the culture as a specific and focused resentment of the humans, of the elves, of magic as an instrument of oppression, and most of all of the world's arrangement that allowed this to be called the natural order, rather than a theft that had been defended by overwhelming force. He was born into a tribe that remembered everything. The Amani kept their history in ceremony and in song and in the oral tradition of their priests, who recounted the Troll Wars not as ancient history, irrelevant to the present, but as the living context for everything the Amani were and everything they were owed. Children grew up knowing about the Highborne arrival, the displacement, the battle, the fire. They grew up understanding that the gleaming kingdom, visible on clear days from Zul'Aman's walls, was built on their ancestors' sacred sites, and that the elves who lived there had never paid for what they took. Every ceremony in Zul'Aman was shaped by this dual consciousness. The lower rites that structured Amani's spiritual life were not simply celebrations of animal spirit power. They were performed with an awareness of context. The bear's strength was invoked in a city that had been pushed back from its ancient range. The eagle's victory called down upon a people who had not had a victory like that since Kithix fell. The initiation ceremonies for young warriors included formal instruction in the history of the displacement, recited by priests who held the words as sacred text. The arrival of the Highborne ships, the raising of Bandinoriel, the burning of Jintha's host. To become an Amani warrior was to take on the history as a personal burden, not by choice, but by membership in the people. Zul'jin absorbed all of that, and then he did something with it that his predecessors had not managed to do. The forest trolls in his time were fractured into multiple competing factions. The Great Defeat had done that, scattered the allied clans, broken the unity that Jintha had temporarily assembled, left the Amani Confederation as a name that described less than it once had. There were forest troll chieftains who commanded groups ranging from a few hundred warriors to a few thousand, each holding their own territory, each conducting independent raids on the elves, each too small to constitute any real threat to Quel'Thalas on their own, and too proud to acknowledge another chieftain's authority. Zul'jin changed that. He went to each of them in turn, not with diplomacy in any conventional sense, not with gifts or promises or the careful language of political negotiation. He went to each one and challenged them. Combat, tests of skill, racing, hunting, whatever the rival chieftain named as their chosen demonstration of worth. He won every time, and each defeated rival would pledge themselves and their warriors to Zul'jin's leadership, because that is how the Amani recognize authority, not through lineage alone, not through political maneuvering, but through demonstrated superiority. The Amani conception of leadership was entirely practical in this sense. A chieftain who could not fight, could not hunt, could not outrun rivals, and outlast opponents in whatever the test was. That chieftain was recognized as holding authority by convention rather than by right. The Amani had limited patience for conventional authority. They had spent 3,000 years failing to reclaim their homeland by following leaders who commanded by position rather than by example, and the communal memory of those failures was woven into how they evaluated who deserved to lead. Zul'jin understood this. More than understood it, he embodied it. Every chieftain he went to challenge saw not just a young warrior who claimed ambition, but a fighter whose physical presence made the claim credible before any competition began. The stories that preceded him through the forest troll territories were already remarkable. He had been killing elves since he was old enough to organize a raid. He had been winning fights that he should, by numbers or position, have lost. He had been demonstrating repeatedly and in front of witnesses exactly the kind of competence that the Amani tradition said a leader had to embody before others owed him their lives. What he was building as he went from tribe to tribe was the same thing Jintha had briefly assembled for the Troll Wars, but built on a more personal foundation. The warriors followed Zul'jin not merely because of organizational necessity, but because they had seen what he was, directly, in whatever competition he had won against their chief. He was real to them in a way that a political abstraction never could be. When he was finished, for the first time since the Troll Wars, the forest trolls had a single leader commanding a single force with a single purpose, reclaiming what had been taken. He also had a clarity of strategic vision that his predecessors had lacked. He understood, from years of studying the elves from the outside, that the raids his people had conducted for millennia were not accomplishing anything of substance. They bled the elves marginally. They kept the borderlands tense. They maintained the Amani's fighting edge and prevented the elves from growing complacent. But they did not threaten Quel'Thalas in any fundamental way. To actually threaten Quel'Thalas, to have a chance at achieving the thing that Jintha's generation had died trying to do, you needed to reach the Sunwell. The Sunwell was the vital organ of the elven kingdom. Tucked away on the Isle of Quel'Thalas, north of the main landmass of Quel'Thalas, it was the pool of pure arcane energy that the Sunstrider dynasty had created to power everything the High Elves were. It fueled their magic, sustained their population, powered their barrier. The elves without the Sunwell were not simply weakened. They were a people without the foundation that made them who they were, addicted to its energy by now, dependent on it in the same way a body depends on a vital organ. Remove the Sunwell and Quel'Thalas would collapse from within, the population, unable to sustain the withdrawal, the magical defenses unable to maintain themselves. Every raid Zul'jin ordered from that point forward was oriented in one way or another toward creating the conditions in which a force might eventually reach the Sunwell. He was patient. He had to be. The thing he was trying to do had failed catastrophically before, and he was not going to fail the same way. His raids on the Farstriders, the elite ranger corps of Quel'Thalas, the finest scouts and archers in the eastern kingdoms, were studied and tactical. He attacked with speed, hit hard before a defense could be organized, and vanished back into the forests before reinforcements could arrive. He did not attempt to hold ground in the borderlands. He was not trying to take territory yet. He was establishing a pattern. The forests beyond Bandonoriel were not safe for the elves, never would be safe for the elves, and the best warriors the elven kingdom could deploy could not change that. The Farstriders were a formidable opponent, and it is worth pausing to appreciate what Zul'jin was dealing with in the Elven Ranger Corps. They were not ordinary soldiers. The Farstriders had been created for a specific purpose, the defense of the long borderlands of Quel'Thalas against exactly the kind of guerrilla forest warfare that the Amani conducted. They trained in these forests from childhood. They learned to read sign the way other people learned to read words. A disturbed patch of moss, a freshly broken branch, the particular angle at which a stone had been displaced by a passing foot. They could move through the old growth forest at night without alerting birds. They shot composite bows with a precision that allowed them to strike targets at distances that made most enemies feel safe. They operated in small units capable of independent action, reporting back to larger command structures, but fully capable of making sound tactical decisions without direction. The forests they patrolled were their home territory. They had maps of the borderlands so detailed that individual game trails were noted, and they updated those maps with each patrol rotation. They communicated across long distances through a system of subtle signals, subtle enough that an Amani scout watching from 100 yards would not recognize them as deliberate communication. They maintained awareness of each other's positions through methods that made ambushing an entire patrol group genuinely difficult, because hitting one part of the formation without triggering the other's response required a level of precision and coordination that most raiding forces could not achieve. Zul'jin had been fighting them for long enough to understand their doctrine and still had not been caught. That is a meaningful statement about both his capability and the level at which he operated. He hunted Farstrider patrols with the same methodical patience that the Farstriders hunted him. He watched their rotation schedules. He identified the gaps between patrol routes, the places where a group moving between checkpoints would be briefly out of sight of both the preceding and following units, where the forest density would absorb the sounds of an engagement before they could carry. He sent smaller scouting parties out ahead of any main force, and those scouting parties were themselves experts in moving without leaving trace, because the Amani had been developing woodcraft in these same forests for just as long as the Farstriders had. The Farstriders hunted him for years. They were genuinely good, among the best trackers and rangers in the world, trained in these same forests, familiar with the terrain he used as cover. They tracked him through forest and across river. They followed his raiding parties back toward Zul'Aman's territory. They never caught him. He was too quick, too disciplined, too aware of the moment when a tactical withdrawal was necessary, and too willing to execute it cleanly. He became a ghost story among the Farstrider patrols, a name that made rangers grip their bows tighter when they heard movement in the undergrowth that they hadn't made themselves. Then one of his raids produced prisoners. The ambush was clean and fast, as his ambushes always were. A Farstrider patrol, moving through the borderlands on a route that Zul'jin had been watching for several weeks, was hit from multiple angles at once and overwhelmed before they could form any organized defense. Several elves were taken alive, and dragged back toward Zul'Aman. Among them was Lor'themar Theron, a Farstrider lieutenant who would one day, after every catastrophe that Warcraft's history would inflict on his people, become the regent lord of what remained of Quel'Thalas. With him were Liadrin, a priestess of the light, serving with the rangers as a healer; Darkon Drathir, a magister of considerable ambition, whose later career would prove him to be one of the most significant traders in elven history; and a Farstrider named Galel. Zul'jin wanted specific information from them. The elven runestones, magical artifacts distributed across Quel'Thalas that formed key components of the kingdom's defensive network, serving as amplifiers and anchors for Ban de Noriel and other magical fortifications, were the kind of intelligence that could fundamentally change the calculus of any assault on Quel'Thalas. He knew they existed. He needed to know exactly where they were and how they interacted with the defenses as a whole. He interrogated Lor'themar himself, personally, with the particular intimacy of a warlord who understands that the most effective interrogation is conducted face to face. He worked methodically, with practiced precision, demonstrating at each step that he was in control and that the discomfort would continue until what he needed was provided. He sliced below the lieutenant's navel. He inserted his fingers into the wound. He painted Lor'themar's face with his own blood. The purpose was specific: to strip away the sense of self-possession that military training instills, to reach the core of terror beneath the controlled exterior, to break the person rather than just the body. He had done this before. He knew how it worked. Then Liadrin acted. The priestess of the light, in a moment of concentrated and desperate purpose, channeled her healing power in a way it was not designed to be used. She took the pain she had endured, not specific to her body, but channeled from everything she had witnessed and experienced in that chamber, and redirected it back at Zul'jin in a single focused, psychic strike. The transfer of agony hit him with the full weight of everything she had accumulated, momentarily overwhelming the detached composure he maintained during interrogation. Lor'themar, who had been holding himself together on the edge of breaking, used that moment. He broke free of his bonds. The room became chaos, guards responding to the unexpected attack on their warlord, prisoners scrambling, the disciplined control of the scene shattering. Darkon, his hands briefly free and his magic accessible, teleported the group to safety. The prisoners escaped. Zul'jin got nothing from them. He remembered their faces, all four of them. He would encounter some of them again. The wider world was changing around him in ways that would create both the opportunity he needed and the humiliation he could not recover from. The Orcish horde had come through the dark portal. The first war had destroyed the kingdom of Stormwind in the south. Warchief Blackhand led the clans north, raiding, pushing the remaining human kingdoms toward defensive collapse. The horde needed allies, and the obvious candidate for the Eastern Kingdom's northern campaigns was the Forest Trolls, a large military force with their own motivation to attack the very kingdom the horde also wanted to hit. Orgrim Doomhammer was sent to negotiate with Zul'jin. Zul'jin refused him. He was not interested in Orcish politics. He was not interested in fighting someone else's war in exchange for promises of support for his own. The Amani had their own campaign, their own enemies, their own timeline. He did not need to subordinate his priorities to an orcish agenda to get what he wanted. He could get it himself. He was wrong about this, but not in a way he could have fully known yet. A few months later, a column of nearly 40 human fighters caught up with Zul'jin and approximately 9 other trolls, in circumstances the lore does not describe in precise detail. Perhaps they tracked him through the borderlands. Perhaps they came upon a raiding group in the wrong place. The details matter less than the outcome. The most feared troll warlord in the Eastern Kingdoms was overwhelmed, chained, and marched west in the custody of soldiers heading toward Durnhold Keep in the Hillsbrad foothills. Durnhold Keep was the kind of facility that existence in a world with multiple dangerous non-human civilizations makes inevitable, a fortified holding structure where significant prisoners and orcs from the early internment efforts could be kept under sufficient guard to make escape impractical. The march west through the Hillsbrad foothills would have taken the column through farmland country, past human settlements going about their daily work, past communities entirely unaware that the column of soldiers passing through their village contained the most dangerous troll alive. The journey would have taken days. Zul'jin chained, one eye already gone from whatever the soldiers or those who captured him had done to him, would have had nothing to do for those days but think and wait. Doomhammer received the intelligence from scouts. He had recently killed Blackhand and taken the title of war chief for himself, a brutal and decisive act that reflected his understanding of the Horde's problems and his willingness to solve them directly. He looked at the information about the captured trolls and made his calculation quickly. He dispatched Rend Blackhand, Blackhand's surviving son, with a sufficient force, and the rescue was performed efficiently. The human guards were overwhelmed, the troll prisoners freed, and all witnesses to the operation were eliminated. Doomhammer brought Zul'jin before him. This time, the conversation was different. Not a general alliance offer, but a specific one, shaped around what the rescue had demonstrated, that the Horde had the capability to act decisively in the Eastern Kingdoms and the willingness to use that capability on Zul'jin's behalf. Doomhammer proposed equal standing, not troll subordination to Orcish command, but a genuine partnership, parallel campaigns with shared objectives, each pursuing their own enemies with mutual support. Zul'jin listened. He set one condition: the elves. The Horde's northern campaign must include a genuine commitment to the destruction of Quel'Thalas, not as an afterthought, not as a secondary goal to be addressed when more important objectives were achieved, but as a primary purpose of the northern offensive. If the Horde would fight his war alongside him, he would fight theirs. Doomhammer agreed. Thousands of forest trolls marched out of Zul'Aman for the second time in Amani history with the same objective Jintha's generation had died trying to achieve. What followed was the closest the Amani had come to realizing their ancient purpose since the Troll Wars ended in disaster. The combined Horde Amani forces moved through the borderlands with a coordination and scale that the elves had not faced since Jintha's host. Zul'jin's warriors moved ahead of the main force in many places. They knew these forests better than anyone, had been raiding them for decades, understood the rhythms of elven patrol routes and the locations of every fortified position along the border. The Farstriders, competent as they were were not equipped to hold every point against a force of this size and commitment. The outer territories fell. Settlements that had been successfully defended against decades of Amani raids found themselves facing something qualitatively different: a sustained offensive with no intention of withdrawing, supported by orcish infantry and the enslaved red dragons that the Horde had acquired through the demon's soul, a weapon of demonic manufacture that allowed direct control over the great dragonflights, forcing creatures of immense power into unwilling servitude. The combined force pushed through the plague lands, still green and inhabited in those days, their fields producing food for Lordaeron's farms and their villages running the rhythms of ordinary human life without any knowledge that their era of peace was ending, and into Eversong Woods itself. Eversong Woods in that period was one of the most beautiful territories in the Eastern Kingdoms. The perpetual magical aura of the Sunwell, radiating outward from the Isle of Quel'Thalas in every direction, suffused the trees with a golden warmth that made the canopy glow even in overcast weather. The forests were ancient and carefully tended. The high elves had been living among these specific trees for 6,000 years, and the relationship between Silvermoon's keepers and the woodland they inhabited was one of the defining aesthetic achievements of elven civilization. The magical sunlight filtered through golden and rust-red leaves regardless of season. Streams ran clear over stones polished to gems by centuries of careful flow management. The pathways between trees had been shaped over generations to carry travelers through the most beautiful angles of light and shadow. For the first time in 3,000 years, Amani warriors were inside Quel'Thalas in force. The forests that had been closed to them since the Highborne arrived on the eastern coast were burning with battle and filled with troll war cries. It was happening. Then the elves raised their final shield. The Sunwell's power was channeled into an impenetrable barrier around Silvermoon's inner core. The magical protection was absolute, not bandinorial, which stopped physical passage, but a direct application of the Sunwell's raw, arcane energy as a defensive field. Even the fire of enslaved red dragons could not pierce it. The offensive stalled. The siege settled in. Doomhammer looked at his strategic situation and made his calculation. The siege was consuming forces at a rate he could not sustain indefinitely. The human capital of Lordaeron, the real political heart of the Alliance, the fall of which would break the coordinated human resistance, was reachable if he committed the forces that were currently bogged down outside Silvermoon. He made his decision. He told Zul'jin he was withdrawing the main Horde force to march south. Zul'jin refused, not as a negotiating position, not as a temporary display of resistance designed to extract better terms. An absolute refusal, grounded in the full weight of everything this moment represented. He had been building toward this for his entire life. His people had been building toward this for 3,000 years. They were at the gates of Silvermoon. The Sunwell was, literally, physically, within reach of the army he was standing with. He would not leave. Doomhammer left anyway. Gul'dan, the orc warlock who had been manipulating events from within the Horde for years, pursuing his own agenda of demon service while nominally serving the Horde's interests, chose this moment to betray the campaign entirely. He took the Stormreaver and Twilight's Hammer clans away from the main force to pursue the tomb of Sargeras, a decision that gutted Doomhammer's ability to press the Alliance. The chaos this introduced into the Horde's command structure during the campaign's critical phase was catastrophic. Without the Horde bulk, without the dragons, without the coordination that had made the initial assault so effective, the Amani were holding a siege of an impenetrable target surrounded by a city whose remaining defenders now knew the main threat had moved on. The elves counterattacked. The balance shifted. What had been a sustainable siege became a fighting withdrawal, then a rout. Near Darrowmere Lake, cut off from his main force in the confusion of the retreat, Zul'jin was surrounded by a Far Strider unit led by Haldoran Brightwing, a ranger of considerable skill and very personal motivation, since he was Lor'themar Theron's closest friend and knew exactly who the warlord they had managed to surround was. They chained him. What followed lasted hours. The Far Striders were not simply disposing of a captured enemy. They had been hunting this specific man for years. They had lost comrades to his raids. Some of them had friends who had been taken prisoner in Amana ambushes and never recovered. The warlord who had painted Lor'thamer's face with his own blood was in chains in front of them. The Darrowmere shoreline where they held him would have been autumn cold, the reeds along the water's edge brittle, the sky above the lake gray and wide. A miserable place to be held against your will. A miserable place to receive what the Far Striders had for him. Haldoran's unit had operated with discipline through the chaos of the retreat, maintaining formation when other groups had scattered, specifically tracking the Amani warlord, because Haldoran had decided that if the chance came, he was not going to miss it. He was a methodical man, careful and controlled, and the control he maintained during what followed was itself a kind of statement about what the years of fighting this particular enemy had cost him. One of them gouged out his right eye. Haldoran's plan was to keep him alive, to march him back to Silvermoon so that Lor'themar, who had survived Zul'jin's interrogation and was now in a position to decide the warlord's fate, could determine what justice looked like. It was a considered decision. The tortured would have his judgment of the torturer. Then the rescue came. Amani warriors had been tracking the Far Striders through the chaos of the retreat, following the unit that had taken their warlord, moving through the forest on parallel paths to the column's line of march. They hit the camp suddenly, from multiple directions at once, in the pattern that Zul'jin himself had taught them: fast, violent, decisive, before a defense could organize. Haldoran Brightwing was wounded in the fighting. Guards scattered, though the controlled space of the interrogation camp became chaos. A fallen spear lay in the dirt within reach of the chained warlord's hand. He grabbed it. He looked at the chain. He sawed through his own left arm until he was free. He walked out. He did not regenerate the arm. He did not regrow the eye. The question of why is genuinely interesting, and the lore allows for multiple answers that are not mutually exclusive. Trolls possess regenerative capability that would, under normal circumstances, allow them to regrow a severed limb over time. It is not instantaneous, it is not without cost, but the biology is there. Veteran soldiers who have fought trolls know to burn wounds rather than simply inflict them, because an unburned wound has a meaningful chance of closing, and a dismembered limb has a real possibility of growing back. One possibility is that Zul'jin was cursed. Loa magic, the divine animal spirit power that formed the foundation of Amani's spiritual practice, can interfere with troll biology in specific ways. A Loa who was offended by Zul'jin, or whose domain covered wounds taken in specific circumstances, might have blocked the regeneration for those injuries as a consequence or a punishment. There are things in Amani lore that suggest the relationship between Zul'jin and certain animal spirits was complicated, and a blocked regeneration would be consistent with that kind of complication. The other possibility, and the one more consistent with everything else known about who Zul'jin was, is that he chose not to heal. Trolls have some degree of conscious influence over their regeneration, not complete control, but the ability to direct or suppress it in limited ways. A troll who wanted to keep a scar, to keep a wound visible rather than healed, could exercise that intention and maintain it over time. Zul'jin, deciding to keep the missing arm and the missing eye because they were more valuable as evidence than his healed absences, would be entirely consistent with his psychology. Consider what those wounds communicated. Every Amani warrior who ever looked at him after that day saw proof carved into the warlord's own body of what the elves had done, not a story told around a fire, not a recounting of events. Physical reality, visible every time Zul'jin walked into a room, that the elves had captured the warlord of the Amani, gouged out his eye, and held him in chains until he had to cut off his own arm to escape. Every enemy who ever faced him on a battlefield saw a warrior who had survived that and was still standing across from them, still holding an axe, still coming forward. There is a specific kind of message sent by a commander who stands in front of his forces demonstrably incomplete and demonstrably unbowed. It is worth more than 1,000 speeches. The wounds were a weapon. He kept them because weapons should be kept. Haldoran Brightwing carried the guilt of that escape for years, possibly for the rest of his life. He had held the greatest enemy Quel'Thalas had ever faced in chains and allowed him to escape. The circumstances were not his fault. He was wounded, his unit was overwhelmed, the rescue was unexpected, but he was a ranger of Quel'Thalas, and the warlord who had bled his people for decades had been right there, and now he was gone into the forest. Zul'jin did not waste time on the sentiment. He had work to do. The Second War ended in defeat for the Horde. The Coordinated Alliance response, driven by leaders who understood the stakes and supplemented by the power of the unified military traditions of Lordaeron, Stromgarde, and the Elves, pushed the Horde back across the continent, retook the territory that had been lost, destroyed the Dark Portal's operational mechanisms, and scattered the Orcish clans into internment camps or flight. Orgrim Doomhammer, captured near the end of the conflict, died years later as a prisoner. Zul'jin returned to Zul'Aman. He had gained nothing from the war. The arrangement of the world was the same as it had been before the Second War began. Quel'Thalas still stood. The Sunwell still empowered the Elven Kingdom. The Far Striders still patrolled the forests east of Bandinorial. The blood that Amani warriors had shed in the invasion, the lives spent in the campaign, had purchased exactly nothing in territorial or strategic terms. The alliance with the Horde had produced the rescue from Durnhold. In exchange, Zul'jin had committed thousands of Amani warriors to a war they did not survive. He had given them the single greatest military opportunity in 3,000 years, and then watched Doomhammer walk away from it, to pursue Orcish strategic priorities. The siege that should have ended with Silvermoon's fall had ended instead with the Amani beaten back and their warlord mutilated. Zul'Aman received him back in silence. Not a celebration. There was nothing to celebrate. The warriors who returned understood exactly what had happened and exactly how close they had been to something that had never been close before. The city that had been built above Kithix's bones received its warlord back missing an eye and an arm, and the meaning of those absences was understood immediately by everyone who saw him. Not as marks of defeat, because Zul'jin's bearing as he walked back through the gates communicated clearly that defeat was not the frame he was operating in, but as marks of the specific cost of this particular attempt, added to the general ledger of costs that the Amani had been accumulating since the Highborne first arrived. He was not done. He was patient. He had always been patient. The cause required patience more than it required anything else, and he had that patience in reserves that decades of frustration had not depleted. The years between the Second War and the Third were years of internal reconstruction. Zul'Aman absorbed its losses the way it always had, by continuing. The city that had never been taken received its survivors back, counted them, organized them, prepared them. There were warriors who had been in the prime of their fighting years when the Second War began and were now past it, their bodies carrying the accounting of what the campaign had cost them. There were younger fighters who had not been old enough for the main campaign, but who now represented the Amani's actual military capability, needing to be trained to the same standard Zul'jin had developed over decades and committed to the same purpose. He trained them himself. The warlord was not a commander who led from behind a strategic table. He was in the training grounds, one-armed, demonstrating the compensating style he had developed after Darrowmere Lake. He fought his younger warriors in practice bouts, and he did not pretend to be what he had been before the maiming. He had adapted, and the adaptation was demonstrably effective, and watching it was itself a form of instruction in what the Amani were supposed to be, a people who absorbed damage and became something useful out of it, rather than something diminished. He watched the post-war world reorganize itself. He watched the Orcish horde shatter in the aftermath of defeat, the clans turning on each other, the demonic corruption that had driven them now without a war to focus it metastasizing into internecine violence. He watched the alliance consolidate its victory, repairing borders and rebuilding settlements, the human kingdoms settling into the post-war order with satisfaction. He watched the elves of Quel'Thalas return to their previous rhythms, maintaining their borders, training their Farstriders, growing if anything more secure in the arrangement they had been enjoying since the Highborne first planted their banner. He spent those years in the way he had always spent time between active campaigns, not in idleness, but in preparation. He rebuilt the Amani military that had been badly bled by the Second War's losses. He reestablished the network of scouts and watchers that monitored elven patrol patterns from beyond the barrier. He maintained the alliances with the allied forest troll groups whose fighters had survived, keeping them pointed at the same purpose, keeping the Amani Confederation alive as a functional force, rather than letting it fragment again into independent groups that would drift back into the old pattern of small-scale uncoordinated raiding. None of it was the right moment. He waited, and then, in the years that are counted as the Third War, everything collapsed at once. Arthas Menethil was the crown prince of Lordaeron, a paladin of the Silver Hand, a young man with real talent and real idealism that under the pressure of a plague he was unable to stop and a guilt he was unable to process, curdled into something monstrous. He followed the undead plague north through Lord Aeron, tried and failed to stop it with conventional methods, made increasingly extreme decisions in increasingly desperate circumstances, and eventually accepted the Runeblade Frostmourne from the Lich King with the justification that the weapon would give him the power to protect his people. It cost him his soul. Quite literally, Frostmourne consumed it, binding Arthas to the Lich King's will. What walked in Arthas's body from that moment forward retained his memories and his tactical mind, but served a different purpose entirely. He led the Scourge, the undead army, north through the Plaguelands and into Quel'Thalas. The purpose was the Sunwell. He needed it to resurrect the necromancer Quel'Thuzad, whose spirit he carried in a phylactery, and whose resurrection was a key component of the Lich King's plans for domination. The elves, already ravaged by the plague spreading across the continent, marshaled their defenses and found them insufficient. The Scourge did not fight the way armies fight. It did not care about tactical attrition, did not feel fatigue, did not need supply lines or rest. It absorbed losses and kept coming. The Bandanoriel barrier, which had stopped troll raiders for thousands of years, was bypassed through Arthas's knowledge of its structure. Silvermoon's defenses were overcome not through magical supremacy, but through sheer persistent weight of numbers applied without mercy. 90% of the high elven population died. An entire people was one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the Eastern Kingdoms, the descendants of the Highborne who had built Quel'Thalas on Amani land thousands of years before, was brought to the edge of extinction in a matter of days. The Sunwell was used to resurrect Quel'Thuzad and then left in a state of desecration, its pure arcane energy corrupted into a festering source of necromantic power. Zul'jin moved. He understood clearly what this moment was, the window he had been waiting for, presented by events he had not caused and could not have engineered, but that were real regardless. The High Elves were shattered. Their military was destroyed. The Farstriders, so competent and so dangerous for all the decades of Amani-Elven conflict, were scattered survivors struggling to hold together the pieces of a civilization that had just been ripped apart by a force neither side had anticipated or prepared for. The Ghostlands in the Third War's aftermath were a devastated landscape. The undead scourge had moved through the area like a harvester of everything that lived, and what they left behind was a zone of corrupted soil, gray and sickly light, and the lingering taint of necromantic energy that gave the region its name. The forests that had once been maintained by elven magical tending now grew twisted and pale. The settlements that had stood for thousands of years were ruins, their stones blackened, their streets empty. The Farstrider lodges that had operated as the primary defensive posts in the southern Quel'Thalas borderlands were abandoned or converted to desperate last-stand positions by survivors who had not yet made their way back to Silvermoon's remnants. For Zul'jin, this territory was not simply an opportunity. It was the same ground his people had fought over for 3,000 years, now finally accessible without a functioning elven military to defend it. The forests he moved through to strike the surviving elf settlements were forests his ancestors had been shut out of, forests where the Loa's animal spirits had moved freely before the Highborne's barrier went up, forests that had always been, in the Amani understanding of the world, theirs. The Amani struck the surviving elf settlements in Eversong Woods and the Ghostlands simultaneously. They moved fast, hitting multiple points at once, using the same tactical precision that had always characterized Zul'jin's campaigns. They claimed significant territory, more territory in a shorter time than the Amani had held in centuries, and established fortified positions in the Ghostlands at locations called Torwatha and Zebwatha. Zul'jin moved naval forces to the Isle of Quel'Thalas to secure the Sunwell's ruins. He was playing every angle simultaneously, pressing every advantage the catastrophe offered. For a brief window, it seemed like he might finally achieve what 3,000 years of Amani history had been building toward. Then Prince Quel'Thalas Sunstrider returned. He came back from the outside world with surviving magisters and what remained of elven forces that had been deployed abroad. He found a kingdom in ruins and a people teetering on the edge of complete dissolution. He organized what could be organized. He renamed his people the Blood Elves, a deliberate choice, a memorial gesture, a declaration that the 90% who had died would be remembered in the very name of those who survived. And he set about defending what remained. The Blood Elves were desperate. They were addicted to the arcane energy the destroyed Sunwell could no longer provide, their need manifesting in escalating psychological and physical symptoms that made the post-war period a trial of will as much as a military challenge. They were fighting on multiple fronts, with the undead still active in their territory and Zul'jin's forces still pressing from the south and east. They had every reason to collapse. They didn't. The determination of people fighting for the last remnant of their existence proved sufficient to halt the Amani advance. Zul'jin was stopped, not driven out of everything he had taken, but stopped from taking more. The Ghostlands remained a contested zone with Amani fortifications that would persist for years. And then came the news that broke something fundamental. The Blood Elves were invited to join the Horde. Thrall's Horde was a different organization from the one Orgrim Doomhammer had led in the Second War. Thrall, an orc who had been raised as a gladiatorial slave by humans, had rediscovered his people's shamanic traditions and had led a mass escape from the internment camps, was trying to build something new from the wreckage of what the demonic corruption had destroyed. His horde valued honor. It emphasized the restoration of Orcish culture as it had existed before the demons arrived. It was making alliances with the Tauren, with the Darkspear trolls, with anyone who shared its values and faced common enemies. It invited the Blood Elves. Zul'jin's reaction to this information is one of the most human moments in his story. He had fought for the Horde. He had been rescued by the Horde. He had taken his people to war alongside the Horde on the specific premise that the Horde would help destroy Quel'Thalas. The Horde had abandoned the siege and directly contributed to the circumstances that had cost him an eye and an arm. And now that Horde, or the organization that called itself the Horde, that used the same name and occupied the same general political space, was standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who had taken his eye, with the people whose ancestors had built their civilization on his ancestors' sacred sites, with the people who represented, in a direct and unbroken line, everything the Amani had been fighting against for 3,000 years. He declared war on both factions, alliance and horde simultaneously. Everyone was an enemy now. If the two great coalitions that divided the world had both chosen to protect his enemies, then both coalitions were obstacles, and he would treat them accordingly. This decision stripped away everything that might have provided him with conventional support. The Zandalari, who maintained various interests in the eastern kingdoms, and who had historically been a source of resources and legitimacy for Amani campaigns, were not going to openly back a simultaneous war against both major world factions. Allied forest troll groups that had maintained loose connections to the Horde through the Darkspear's membership would pull back from full commitment. The practical support structures that any military campaign requires, logistics, intelligence networks, diplomatic cover, were all diminished by the decision to have every hand against him. He did not care. He had been building the Amani military on Amani terms for his entire career, and those terms had always included the premise that the world was fundamentally against his people and that this could not be changed by choosing the right patron. The Horde's abandonment of the Second War Siege had proven that no alliance would hold when the other party's interests diverged from Amani interests. The only forces he could fully rely on were the forces he had built and led and trained himself. He would fight with those forces, or he would not fight at all. I spit on Da Horde. I hate you. I hate you all. Those words were not the expression of wounded pride or political calculation. They were the reaction of a man who had concluded that the world's arrangement was entirely hostile to his people's existence, and that the only rational response was to acknowledge that hostility completely and oppose it with everything he had. He could not win that war. He knew he probably could not win it. But he had never been fighting this war because he expected to win it. He had been fighting it because it needed to be fought. The logic of this position is worth spending a moment with because it is easy to dismiss as the rationalization of someone who has been broken by defeat and is looking for a way to frame continued feudal action as meaningful. But that reading misses what the Amani's 3,000-year project had always been about. They were not fighting because they expected to succeed. They were fighting because to stop fighting would be to accept, in the most final possible way, that what was done to them was done, that the elves had arrived, taken the forests, raised their barrier, built their city, and that was now simply the way things were and would always be. For the Amani, acceptance of that kind was not a form of pragmatism or wisdom. It was a form of erasure. It meant agreeing that the wound was not a wound anymore, that 3,000 years of time had converted a theft into a legitimate fact of the world's arrangement. Zul'jin had no patience for that conversion. The length of time that had passed was not evidence that the theft had been retroactively justified. It was evidence that injustice, left uncontested, simply persists and grows comfortable in its persistence. He was not going to make injustice comfortable. He did not have it in him. He had proven that on the Daromir shore, cutting off his own arm to avoid being delivered to Silvermoon. He had proven it every time the Farstriders thought they were closing in, and he vanished back into the forest one more time. He was going to contest it until he couldn't. The plan that Zul'jin and Hex Lord Malakras devised for the final campaign reflected the hard lesson of every previous attempt. The elves had magical power that the Amani could not match through martial means alone. Every time the Amani had pushed toward Quel'Thalas with sufficient numbers, the elves had deployed magical defenses that neutralized the advantage numbers provided. The fire of 100 human mages in the Troll Wars, the Sunwell Barrier during the Second War, the Magister's counterattack after the Third War. If the Amani were going to achieve anything different this time, they needed to close the magical gap. Malakras had been thinking about this problem for years. He was a Vile Branch troll, not Amani by birth but by alliance, who had studied Zandalari High priest traditions with the particular intensity of a student who has identified something in the source material that the teachers are not teaching. The Zandalari High priests maintained relationships with Loa through long cultivation, ritual, prayer, offering, and demonstrated devotion. It was a slow process requiring generations of maintained covenant. Malakras was not interested in slow processes. He had developed a different method, not cultivation of a relationship, capture. The preparation for what Malakras intended was months in the making. He needed ritual spaces prepared to exacting specifications, sanctums within Zul'Aman's complex that could serve as containment chambers, each aligned to the particular domain of the Loa so it would be used to trap. The altars had to be consecrated in specific ways, the binding materials assembled from components that Malakras had been collecting through agents operating across the eastern kingdoms and beyond. The priests who would assist him were chosen for their knowledge rather than their loyalty to traditional practice, which is to say they were chosen specifically because they would not object on theological grounds to what was being asked of them. The Loa themselves were approached through methods that resembled ordinary worship in their surface forms. Invocations were spoken, offerings were made. The familiar ceremonies that had structured Amani spiritual practice for thousands of years were performed with apparent sincerity. The animal spirits, whose attention to Amani affairs had been maintained through that continuous devotion, came as they always came when called, into the resonance of the ritual, their divine presence, feeling the pull of familiar worship and responding to it. And then Malakras closed the trap. The great animal spirits of the Amani, the Loa who had received troll worship and maintained divine attention on Amani affairs for thousands of years, were powerful enough, if their essence could be captured and bound into mortal flesh, to give troll warriors capabilities that matched or exceeded elven arcane magic. The question was whether it could be done, and Malakras believed it could. 4 great Amani Loa would be targeted: Nalarak, the bear, the mountain, the dreamer, the Lord of War, whose strength was primal and enormous in the way that geological forces are enormous, Akilzon, the eagle, the spirit of victory, of oaths, of absolute conviction, whose command over storm and sky expressed the Amani ideal of unstoppable purpose, and Janalai, the dragonhawk, the spirit of fire and rebirth, whose connection to transformation through flame was as much philosophical as physical, Halazi, the lynx, the hunter, the swift, the predator whose speed and precision represented Loa power in its most focused and lethal form. These four would be robbed of their divine freedom and their essence bound into four champion warriors. Malakras himself would bind his soul to the darkest available Loa power, drawing from sources outside the Amani covenant entirely. The binding ritual, when it was performed, was not swift or clean. The Loa did not simply settle into the vessels Malakras had prepared for them. They resisted with everything that divine beings resist with, not physical force, but spiritual weight, the deep wrongness of being compressed into a form too small for what they were, a wrongness that the champion warriors, chosen as vessels, experienced as something close to being unmade and rebuilt simultaneously. The priests who assisted Malakras worked through the night of each binding, maintaining the containment while the Loa fought it, their chanting hoarse by morning, their hands bleeding from where they had pressed them against the resonant stones that formed the ritual's physical anchor. Nalarak's binding produced a warrior whose physical mass increased visibly as the bare essence settled into him, not a transformation into animal form, but a densification, a grounding, as though the mountain's weight had been folded into a troll's body, and the troll had somehow kept standing. Akilzon's binding filled the vessel with a charged electric presence, the air around Maniye crackling with something that was not quite storm and not quite conviction, but occupied the space between them. The warriors who stood near the bound champions in those first hours reported feeling the Loa's resentment through the vessel's skin like heat from a fire that was burning the wrong way. Zul'jin approved it without hesitation. The rage that had been building since the Second War, the fury at the Blood Elf integration into the Horde, the accumulated frustration of watching Quel'Thalas survive catastrophe after catastrophe and still stand, all of it had burned away any consideration that might have given him pause. The Loa's consent was not a factor he was weighing. Any power was acceptable. What the lore reveals only in hindsight is the full cost of this decision. When Malakras took the Loa's essence by force, binding divine beings against their will into mortal flesh, the Loa understood what had been done. They did not merely experience it as an offense. They experienced it as a fundamental betrayal of the relationship that had existed between the Amani and their gods since Zul'Aman was first founded, since the city was built on Kithix's bones and the first priests made the first covenants with the animal spirits. That relationship could not survive what Malakras did to it. The Amani would lose their gods because of this decision. Not during the raid itself, not as an immediate consequence, but permanently. The animal spirits withdrawing from all Amani communion after they were freed, severing a connection that had been maintained for 16,000 years. The people who had founded their identity on the covenant, with bear and eagle and lynx and dragonhawk, would be left in spiritual silence. The ceremonies would still be performed. The prayers would still be said. No one would be listening. This was the price of the power Malakras stole. Zul'jin did not know this when he approved the plan. He found out the way everyone finds out about the prices of things that seem acceptable in the moment of decision, after the moment had passed and the bill came due, and one more dimension of the cost made itself visible immediately. Among the four champions selected to receive Loa essence, the warriors who would become living avatars of divine power, one was Maniye, Zul'jin's son. Whether Maniye volunteered or was chosen Whether this was the son's own decision, or his father's necessity, or some combination of both, is not recorded. What is recorded is that Manye became the vessel for Akilzon's captured essence, the eagle spirit, the Loa of victory and oaths, his consciousness sharing his body with an imprisoned god. The warriors who looked at Manye in that state were looking at the chieftain's heir made divine, a figure who embodied simultaneously the pride of the Amani legacy and the desperate measure of its final campaign. Zul'jin was sending his son into a battle as a vessel for a stolen god in a plan that required the theft of divine beings from their own people's spiritual practice for a war that had already cost more than any reasonable accounting would allow. He proceeded. The timing of the assault was militarily sound. The dark portal had reopened. The Burning Crusade, the Legion's second great invasion of Azeroth, had pulled military resources away from their home territories and into a dimensional war in Outland. The Blood Elves, deeply invested in the Burning Crusade campaign through their own complicated political situation involving Quel'Thalas' deal with Illidan Stormrage, had deployed significant forces abroad. Quel'Thalas was exposed in the way. It hadn't been since the Third War's immediate aftermath. Zul'jin coordinated attacks from Zul'Aman, Torwatha, and Zebwatha simultaneously, creating a multi-front pressure that was designed to overwhelm defenses spread thin by the Outland deployment. Inside the temple complex, the ritual was progressing. The four champions were empowered with stolen Loa essence. Prisoners, including a group of Horde-aligned adventurers captured in the Ghostlands, were chained at altars around the complex, scheduled for sacrifice to fuel the ritual further. Zul'Aman in those weeks had the quality of a place preparing for something that everyone inside knows is the final attempt at the only thing that has ever mattered. The priests moved through the corridors with a driven focus. The warriors sharpened weapons with the particular attention of fighters who understand they are preparing for the battle they have been waiting their whole lives to fight. The animal spirit altars around the complex were lit and maintained with careful devotion. The irony of worshipping the gods you had just imprisoned, either not fully grasped or deliberately not thought about. Zul'jin himself moved between the preparation sites with the controlled intensity of a commander who has been planning this specific operation for years and can now see it taking the shape he designed for it. Every piece of the plan was in motion. The Amani war machine, rebuilt over decades of patient preparation, was pointed at the thing it had always been pointed at. Whatever the cost would turn out to be, the attempt was real and the army was ready. The Horde, recognizing that an active major assault on Quel'Thalas would create a second front they could not afford during the Legion crisis, sent champions into Zul'Aman. There was a man named Bud Nedrek who was at the entrance to Zul'Aman when the champions arrived. He was a treasure seeker of no particular ideological commitment, whose primary concern in the middle of a low theft ritual, an ongoing prisoner sacrifice, and an imminent military assault was the contents of Zul'Aman's vaults. He encouraged the champions to help themselves to whatever was lying around while they addressed the war crime in progress. This detail exists in the game, unexplained, as a kind of deadpan comment on how the world works. The champions fought through the complex with the focused efficiency of people who had survived enough of Azeroth's crises to have developed opinions about them. They moved through Zul'Aman's layered architecture, through the outer precincts where the animal spirit altars burned, through the bridges and walkways that connected the great towers, through the sanctum levels where the Loa essence bindings had been performed, and where the bound champions now waited as guardians of the ritual's continuation. The complex itself was a monument to the full scope of Amani history compressed into architecture. The oldest sections, closest to the foundations, bore stonework so ancient that the carvings had blurred into soft suggestions of the forms they had once sharply depicted: animal shapes, hunting scenes, the stylized figures of priests and warriors in the formal poses of Loa ceremony. Above them, each successive generation of construction had added new chambers and corridors in styles that showed the subtle evolution of Amani craft across centuries. The newest constructions, built in preparation for this specific campaign, had a rawer quality, stone cut with urgency rather than patience, the carvings less elaborate, the proportions more functional than ceremonial. 3,000 years of architecture, ascending from foundations laid above the body of a dead god creature. And at the top of all of it, Zul'jin waited. They found Nalorak's avatar, the bear-fused champion, massive and brutal, and defeated him. They found Akilzon's avatar, Manye, the warlord's son, the eagle, spirit's captive vessel, and defeated him. They found Janalai's avatar, the Dragonhawk champion, and defeated him. They found Halazi's avatar, the Lynx champion, and defeated him. They found Hexlord Malakras, bound to his dark power, architect of everything, and they killed him too. And then they reached the center of Zul'Aman, where Zul'jin waited. He had known they were coming since they entered the complex. He had heard the sounds of his plan being dismantled one piece at a time. Each champion defeated, each Loa spirit freed, the ritual disintegrating, his son dying somewhere in the temple above. He did not run. He did not attempt to flee or negotiate or offer terms. He looked at the champions standing in front of him, members of the Horde, the faction that had accepted his enemies as allies, the organization that had promised him Quel'Thalas and then abandoned the siege. And he spoke. He said everything that needed to be said. This was our land, Troll Land. We Amani was here before anyone. The elves and their alliance came to drive us out. But we never give up. We never forget. The elves took my eye. I cut off my own arm to escape them. And now, they fight alongside the Horde. I spit on the Horde. I hate you. I hate you all. But I got a surprise for you now. So come on in. The Amani never give up. We never forget. We never die. This is our land. You want to stay? You stay here forever. We're going to bury you here. Every sentence of that speech was factually true. The Amani were on the Eastern Kingdom's northeastern coast before the Highborne arrived. The elves came and drove them out of their homeland. He personally lost his eye to elven captors. He personally cut off his own arm to escape them. The Blood Elves were in fact fighting alongside the Horde. These were not inventions of a wounded psyche or distortions of a paranoid mind. They were the precise facts of his life, stated in the order they happened. The speech is also a kind of last will, not a will in the legal sense, the warlord without an arm and without an eye, whose plan has just been dismantled behind him, one piece at a time, standing in front of people who have come to kill him, does not stop to draft documents, but a last will in the more fundamental sense, a statement of what the person who is about to die believed was true about the world, offered to the world one final time before it can no longer be offered. Notice the structure of it. He starts with the foundational claim. Dis was our land, troll land. We Amani was here before anyone. And from that foundation, everything else follows with inescapable logic. The elves came and drove them out. This is what happened to the land. He personally lost his eye, personally cut off his own arm. This is what it cost the man who tried to undo it. And now the faction that was supposed to be his ally against those elves is fighting alongside them. This is the betrayal that completes the catalog. He structures the speech the same way a legal argument is structured. You establish the founding premise, you trace the violations of it, you demonstrate the totality of the wrong. The difference is that there is no court, there is no judge, there is no authority that is going to hear the argument and render a verdict. The only thing that was ever going to change anything was the fight, and the fight is about to end. He knows that. He says the argument anyway, because the argument is true, and a true thing should be said, even when no one who can act on it is listening. He gave no ground in it. He did not soften the grievance or acknowledge the complexity of the history or extend any gesture toward the possibility of understanding. He said what was true, and he said it plainly, and he did not ask anyone in that room to agree with him, because he had never been fighting for agreement. He had been fighting because the alternative to fighting was accepting that what was done to his people was simply done, permanently, irreversibly, with no one ever having had the accountability for it that it deserved. He could not stand that. He could never stand that. And so here he was, at the end, standing in the ruins of the final attempt, saying it one more time. The fight that followed was not simple. Zul'jin had the stolen power of 4 Eloa flowing through him, the essence of divine beings whose freedom had been purchased at the price of the Amani's own spiritual future. He channeled them one by one as the battle escalated, transforming in ways that natural troll biology does not allow, into the bear's overwhelming mass, into the eagle's elemental storm, into the lynx's predatory speed, into the dragonhawk's fire. He yelled through the fight in the way warriors yell, not rhetorical threats, but declarations made to the air, to history, to the thing he had spent his life being. Nobody badda dan me. Got me some new tricks, like me Bruda Bear. There be no hidin' from de eagle. Let me introduce to you my new Brudas, Fang and Claw. You don't have to look to the sky to see the dragonhawk. He fought to the edge and then passed it. He did not hold anything in reserve. He did not bargain for his life. He did not ask for terms. He had made his choice the moment he grabbed that fallen spear, and he had lived with it for decades, and he was going to die with it now. The champions brought him down. He lay on the stones of Zul'Aman in the city that had been built on the bones of a god creature 16,000 years ago, and he said what he needed to say one last time. Maybe me fall, but da Amani Empire never gonna die. Not a prayer, not a plea, a statement of belief made by a man who had spent his entire life testing that belief against the hardest possible circumstances and had not been proven wrong about it yet. Bud Nedrek picked up a vial of Zul'jin's blood, examined it, and dropped it back in the dirt. He was looking for gold. He saw no value in the blood of the greatest troll warlord in 3,000 years. The silence after the fight had the particular quality of silence after something large and definitive has ended. The Loa essences, freed from both the champion vessels and from Zul'jin himself, the four stolen divine beings released at last from the captivity that Malakras had imposed, did not linger in the space. They were gone in the way that things return to where they belong, not with fanfare or visible departure, but with a shift in the atmosphere of the place, a feeling of something enormous being suddenly absent. The sanctums of Zul'Aman, which had been charged with the stolen power of animal spirits for the durations of the campaign, went quiet. What the champions left behind when they walked out of Zul'Aman was a city that had just lost its warlord, its heir, its witch doctor, and its Loa in a single afternoon. They took nothing from it except the prisoners they had come to rescue. The vaults that Bud Nedrek had been so interested in remained in whatever state they were in. The Amani warriors, who had been defending the outer precincts of the complex, who had heard the sounds of the internal battle moving toward its conclusion, understood from the quality of the silence that followed what it meant. The ones who survived the afternoon dispersed into the forests that had always been the Amani's primary refuge. The Amani fractured almost immediately after Zul'jin's death, in the way that organizations built around one person's dominant will always fracture when that person is suddenly absent. Manier was also dead, killed in the same raid that killed his father, his body buried somewhere in Zul'Aman's levels, in whatever state Ekelzone's departure had left it. The succession that should have followed, the eldest son inheriting the role that the father had held, was not available. Manya's widow, a woman named Zarama, took a regent's position, holding the fractured pieces of the Amani leadership together while the couple's young child grew toward maturity. Multiple pretenders to the warlord's authority appeared almost immediately, warriors who had served under Zul'jin and believed themselves entitled to continue his legacy, chieftains of allied groups who saw an opportunity to acquire the power the warlord had accumulated, opportunists who understood that the vacuum left by Zul'jin's death was enormous and real. Zarama's position was genuinely difficult. She was not a warrior in Zul'jin's mold, not a chieftain who had earned authority through a string of personal combat victories against rivals. Her claim to authority was political. She was the widow of the heir, the mother of the heir's child, the person around whose existence the Amani succession had its most legitimate claim. In another culture, in another tradition, that would have been sufficient. Among the Amani, it was a claim that needed to be backed by something more tangible, and Zarama knew it. She backed it with stubbornness. She remained in Zul'Aman when every practical consideration suggested that the safer course was to withdraw. She maintained the administrative structures that Zul'jin had built, the coordination between allied forest troll groups, the distribution of resources among the warriors who remained, the protocols of communication between Zul'Aman's leadership and the Amani outposts in the Ghostlands. She did all of this without a warlord's personal charisma and without a warrior's demonstrated physical supremacy. And she did it long enough for the succession crisis to stabilize into something manageable. The Loas withdrew. This consequence unfolded more slowly than the succession crisis, a spiritual silence that deepened over months rather than crashing down in days. But it was in some ways more devastating than any military defeat. The ceremonies were still performed, the prayers were still said, The priests still maintained the forms of worship that had structured Amani life since Zul'Aman's founding, but the animal spirits did not respond. Akilzon, Nalorak, Halazi, Janalai, freed from the captivity that Malakras had imposed, they were gone. They had not been freed into joyful return to their people's spiritual attention. They had been freed into absence. The priests who first noticed this, who performed a ceremony and felt nothing where before there had always been something, who spoke the words that had always produced some resonance and heard only silence, did not immediately understand what had happened. They assumed they had made an error in the ceremony, that the preparation had been insufficient, that the timing was wrong. They repeated the ceremonies with greater care. They fasted and purified themselves and prepared the altars with more precision than they had ever brought to anything, nothing. It took time for the understanding to settle in. The Loa were not absent because of ceremonial error. They were absent because of what had been done to them, and that was a different kind of problem entirely. You cannot apologize your way out of having captured and enslaved divine beings. You cannot perform your way back into a covenant that was broken through a fundamental act of betrayal. The silence was not a test, it was a verdict. The Amani had been worshipping their animal gods for 16,000 years. The covenant between the people and the Loa was as old as Zul'Aman itself, as old as the victory over Kithix that had given the city its founding purpose. And it was broken because the warlord and his witch doctor had decided that winning mattered more than the relationship. A warrior named Aqir emerged as the most significant successor. He was capable, fierce, and could invoke Zul'jin's memory with genuine legitimacy. He had fought for the Amani cause. He understood the grievances. He had the martial credentials that Amani warriors respected. The Zandalari backed him for reasons that mixed genuine Amani support with Zandalari imperial ambitions of their own. A strong Amani presence in the eastern kingdoms served Zandalari political interests, and Da'akara was a useful instrument for those interests. Da'akara began rebuilding the Amani military and declaring his intention to complete what Zul'jin had started. Then the cataclysm happened. Deathwing, the aspect of Earth, the dragon whose sanity had been shattered by the old god's corruption, whose purpose as the Earth Warder had been twisted into its opposite, erupted from his hiding place beneath Deepholm and tore through the maelstrom, shattering geological stability across the entire planet. The world broke, continents shifted, the elemental planes destabilized, fissures opened across previously stable terrain, populations were displaced, coastlines changed. The political and social maps of Azeroth were redrawn in weeks. Prophet Zul of the Zandalari had been watching the slow decline of troll civilizations for years before the cataclysm, and he interpreted the disaster not as a catastrophe to be survived, but as a reorganizing moment to be exploited. He sent emissaries to every major surviving troll empire, Amani, Gurubashi, Drakari, Faraki, with the same offer. Unite under a restored troll empire, reclaim what had been taken, use the world's distraction and destabilization to accomplish what couldn't be done in a stable environment. To the Amani, he offered Zul'jin's dream, the destruction of Quel'Thalas and the reclamation of the northeastern forests. Many Amani accepted. Under Da'akara's leadership, with Zandalari resources funding the reconstruction, Zul'Aman was rebuilt and a new offensive prepared. The temple complex that had been the site of Zul'jin's final stand was restored. Warriors were equipped and trained. The plan was, in its essentials, the same plan Zul'jin had always had, just without him. The rebuilt Zul'Aman was both familiar and hollow. The physical structure was restored faithfully. The great towers, the connecting bridges, the animal spirit sanctums in their proper positions along the complex's architecture. But the spirit sanctums, now tended by priests who performed their functions in the knowledge that the Loas were not listening, had a quality that everyone who lived and worked in them could feel but no one wanted to name. The forms were correct. The substance that had always animated the forms was gone. Zul'Aman without its Loa was a monument performing its own ritual in an empty theater. Da'akara understood this, at least partially. He did not have access to Loa power in the direct sense that Zul'jin's champions had wielded it. The bound essences had departed with the champions' deaths and would not be captured again, not because Malacras's method was unavailable in principle, but because the Amani priests who survived were not willing to attempt it twice. But he had the Zandalari backing and the accumulated military capability of a rebuilt tribe, and he believed that was enough. Vol'jin saw it differently. The Darkspear troll, who led his tribe as a Horde loyalist, had his own opinions about what trolls should be, and those opinions did not include following Zandalari orders into a war that served Zandalari interests. He understood the Amani grievances. He was a troll. He knew the history. He recognized the legitimacy of what had been taken. But he also believed that the path Da'akara and the Zandalari were offering would end the same way every previous version of this path had ended, with more troll dead and nothing changed. He formed an alliance that should not have worked but did. His own Darkspear fighters, Ranger General Haldoran Brightwing of Quel'Thalas, the Farstrider who had captured Zul'jin during the Second War and lived with the guilt of his escape ever since, and Varisa Windrunner's Silver Covenant, a group that combined high elf rangers who had rejected the Horde with blood elves who had joined it, working together in defiance of the political division that separated them. Haldoran's presence in that alliance deserves a moment's consideration. This was the ranger who had held Zul'jin in chains on the Darrowmere shore and failed to bring him to Silvermoon. He had spent decades with that failure. He had watched Zul'jin build the Burning Crusade campaign from the intelligence his unit had failed to stop. He had participated in the Burning Crusade raid as an observer, sending Horde champions into the complex while he coordinated from outside, unable to be the one who finally ended it because the politics of the situation put him across the table from the faction the champions belonged to. And now, in the rebuilt Zul'Aman, he was going in person. Vol'jin led the assault on Zul'Aman personally. The champions who entered found Hex Lord Malacras there. He had survived the Burning Crusade raid. The specifics of how are not clearly documented, but the witch doctor who had engineered the LOA theft and been killed by adventurers was somehow present in the rebuilt complex. He attempted the same ritual again. He failed and was killed for the second time, more definitively. Da'akara was killed by the champions. The Zandalari-backed push ended. Haldoran Brightwing fought in the same complex where his old adversary had made his final stand. He did not face Zul'jin. That reckoning had already happened through other hands. But he put down the successor, the continuation of the project that Zul'jin had started. Whether that closed the chapter for him in any meaningful way is not recorded. Guilt of that kind does not close cleanly. The Amani story continued past the cataclysm in ways that showed both the persistence of Zul'jin's legacy and its limitations. The Zandalari's imperial ambitions extended into Pandaria. When Prophet Zul organized the Troll tribe's participation in the attempt to resurrect the Storm Emperor Lei Shen on the Isle of Thunder, Amani fighters participated as the Amanishi faction. An Amani warrior named Khazrajin sat on the Council of Elders in Lei Shen's court, representing Amani interests in the coalition. He was killed by Horde and Alliance forces when they stormed the Isle of Thunder. More Amani dead. More Amani purpose bent towards Zandalari goals. More of Zul'jin's legacy spent on campaigns that were not quite the campaign he had spent his life fighting. The pattern here is worth noting because it repeated itself across the post-Zul'jin generations in a way that reveals something about how the Amani's strategic position had changed since his death. Under Zul'jin, the Amani's participation in larger coalitions had always been conditional. He had agreed to fight for the Horde only after extracting a specific commitment about Quel'Thalas, had maintained the siege even when Doomhammer walked away from it, had declared war on the entire world rather than accept an arrangement that served someone else's interests rather than his people's. The Amani under Zul'jin were never tools that someone else could pick up and point. After his death, that changed. Dakara accepted Zandalari backing and Zandalari's strategic direction for the Cataclysm campaign. The Amanishi on the Isle of Thunder were there because the Zandalari wanted them there, in service of a project resurrecting Lei Shen that had nothing to do with Quel'Thalas or the northeastern forests. The Amani had become a faction that other powers could mobilize for other purposes, which is a consequence of losing the singular leader around whose will all of those purposes had previously been subordinated to one. In Zuldazar, the Zandalari capital, Amani enclaves in a district called Talaman maintained their characteristic separateness from the broader political structure. They harassed merchants who traded with traditional enemies, extorted traders who passed through, resisted incorporation into anyone else's arrangement of troll unity. They participated in King Rastakhan's funeral when the aged Zandalari monarch fell, a gesture toward the deep connection between Amani and Zandalari histories, made by people who were simultaneously refusing to become part of the Zandalari political project. They were still Amani. They were still refusing to accept that the old arrangements were final. The refusal had become embedded in the culture at a level deeper than politics, deeper than military strategy, deep enough to persist through the death of the leader who had embodied it most completely. This is Zul'jin's most durable legacy, and it is not the one that tends to appear in the official histories of either the Alliance or the Horde. The legacy that gets recorded by the people who eventually defeated him is the raids, the torture, the stolen Loa, the prisoner sacrifices. The legacy that persists in Zul'Aman, in the attitudes of the Amani who came after him, in the culture that Zul'jarra is trying to lead through a void invasion in the Midnight Era, is simpler and more difficult to extinguish. He demonstrated, by living the way he lived, that refusing to accept an unjust arrangement as permanent was possible. That one person with enough will could hold together enough of a people to constitute a genuine ongoing challenge to the most powerful forces in the Eastern kingdoms. That the correct response to an ancient wrong was not to make peace with it, but to keep pointing at it, keep naming it, keep insisting that it was a wrong and not simply history. He was wrong about many things. He was right about that one. The Amani who came after him inherited the refusal alongside the grief. They inherited the Loa silence and the fractured succession and the memory of the final campaign's catastrophic cost. They also inherited the fact that their grandfather had made Silvermoon nervous for decades, had stood in Eversong Woods in force, had come closer to the Sunwell than any hostile force had come since Jintha's generation. The people who refused to die, who rebuilt after the Burning Crusade raid, rebuilt again after Da'akara's death, maintained enclaves in Zuldazar and positions in the Ghostlands, were carrying forward not just the grievance, but the proof that the grievance could be carried forward, that it had been carried forward by one man with one arm and one eye for longer than most civilizations last. Somewhere in the structure of the Shadowlands, the realm that receives Azeroth's dead, the dimension where souls go when the body's life ends, Zul'jin's story found one final, unexpected development. The Shadowlands is divided into realms, each governed by one of the covenants, and each receiving a different kind of soul. According to the Arbiter's judgment, Bastion, the Sky Realm, receives those who gave their lives in devoted service. Ardenweld, the Spirit Forest, receives those whose essence was tied to nature and renewal. Maldraxxus, the realm of death magic and endless combat, receives warriors and survivors who earned their rest through struggle. Revendreth, the Gothic castle kingdom of the Venthyr, receives the prideful, the cruel, the complicated, souls who cannot ascend to whatever rest awaits them until they have been stripped of what made them terrible and forced, through painful and methodical process, to reckon with it. Revendreth is a place of deliberate darkness. The architecture is all spires and arches, stone so ancient it has taken on the gray pallor of things that have not seen sunlight in an age. The Venthyr who inhabit it are creatures of ceremony and control. They feed on sin, literally extracting it from the souls they process in a ritual that is simultaneously judgment and consumption. The process is not designed to be pleasant. It is designed to be effective. The soul that enters Revendreth as a prideful wreck is supposed to leave it, eventually, after centuries of systematic confrontation with what it was, as something capable of moving forward. Zul'jin went to Revendreth. He appears there as a wrathful soul, carrying his sin stone, the record of what he was and what he did, the accumulated account that the Venthyr would work through with him, in a hidden crypt in the Halls of Atonement. He is described as reminiscing about how elves killed him. Even in death, in a realm explicitly designed to confront souls with what they were, the obsession continues. He is still, in whatever form persists after the body is gone, a troll who lost his eye to elves and cannot stop thinking about it. The significance of Revendreth, rather than any of the other destinations, is worth sitting with. The Arbiter who assessed every soul that passed through and sorted it to its appropriate destination with perfect knowledge of what that soul was, looked at everything Zul'jin had done across his lifetime. The raids, the torture, the alliance that he honored until it was abandoned, the stolen Loa, the son sent to die in a vessel for a captured god, the decades of war that cost his people their spiritual connection to their gods. The Arbiter looked at all of that and determined, not beyond redemption, there is something here that the Venther's process can work on. This soul goes to Revendreth, not to the Maw. What the Arbiter saw in him that justified Revendreth rather than the Maw is not explicitly stated, but the shape of it can be inferred from everything that came before. Zul'jin's cruelties were in service of a cause that had genuine legitimacy at its foundation. His pride was not the hollow vanity of someone protecting an inflated self-image, but the pride of a man who had refused to accept injustice as the permanent condition of his people. His wrath was wrath with reasons behind it. The Venther's process, strip away what made you terrible, force you to look at it honestly, leave the rest, requires that there be a rest. The Arbiter apparently found one in Zul'jin. Sylvanas Windrunner, when she was shown the structure of the Shadowlands and what souls went where, was furious about this. She had been condemned to the Maw, the realm of absolute darkness, the place where souls were delivered to jailer Zoval and consumed rather than processed, and she considered it a fundamental injustice that Zul'jin, whose crimes she assessed as comparable to, or worse than her own, had received a chance at eventual atonement. The Arbiter's sorting had placed her in the worst possible destination, and given Zul'jin the second worst destination, which still contained the possibility of something better. Whether her fury was warranted is a theological question the Shadowlands expansion does not definitively resolve. What it does establish is that the Arbiter saw Zul'jin as redeemable, which is more generous than many who faced him in life might have expected. The second Shadowlands complication is more mysterious and has never been fully resolved in the lore. Bwonsamdi is the Loa of death, the divine being who governs the souls of trolls. His domain is specific, trolls. His authority is comprehensive. He holds contracts with the Darkspear tribe and has claimed jurisdiction over troll souls generally, including, as he once stated explicitly, even those who tried to kill me. There is no death among trolls that falls outside his portfolio. This is his power, his ancient role, the thing he has been since before the current arrangement of the Shadowlands was established, and yet Zul'jin is in Revendreth, under Venther authority, sorted by the Arbiter into the Shadowlands general system rather than into Bwonsamdi's domain. Bwonsamdi once admitted, with the kind of careful casualness that suggests something significant is being avoided, that he lost a soul once. He did not elaborate on which soul. He did not explain how a god of death loses a soul. The implication is widely understood among those who have studied Azerothian lore. The soul Bwonsamdi lost was Zul'jin's. How a mortal troll, however fierce, however charged with stolen Loa power in his final moments, however defined by decades of rage and purpose, managed to slip past the actual divine entity whose specific job was to collect troll souls, is one of the genuinely interesting, unanswered questions in Warcraft lore. One possibility circles back to the Loa binding itself. In his final battle, Zul'jin drew on the essence of 4 captured divine beings. For the duration of that fight, he was not simply a troll, but something simultaneously troll and Loa, a mortal vessel charged with divine power, however stolen, however resentfully held. When that vessel died and the soul departed, it may have carried something of that divine charge with it, enough to complicate Bwonsamdi's claim, enough to create the kind of spiritual ambiguity that the Arbiter could resolve into the Shadowlands general system rather than into any Loa's specific domain. Another possibility is more unsettling. The Loa that Malakras drew on for his own binding, the dark powers outside the Amani covenant, may have left a mark on the entire ritual that affected every soul touched by it, including Zul'jin's. Powers outside the normal framework of Azeroth's divine order can create exceptions to rules that were never designed to account for them, and a soul that had been saturated in a legitimately bound Loa essence, channeled through a ritual that drew on forces Bwonsamdi did not authorize, might simply have become difficult to categorize in the way that death gods categorize things. It is consistent in its way with everything else about him. He escaped Holderon, Brightwing at Darrowmere Lake. He escaped every Farstrider hunting party for decades. In death, by whatever mechanism, he apparently escaped the god of troll death. In the halls of atonement, he is still thinking about elves. The fullest accounting of what Zul'jin's choices cost the Amani comes generations later, in the life of a young woman who is trying to lead a people through the consequences of decisions that were made before she was born. Zul'jarra is Zul'jin's granddaughter. She is the daughter of Zarama, who was Manye's widow, Manye, who died in Zul'Aman with Akilzon's essence in his body, the son who was sent into the final campaign and did not come back. Zul'jarra grew up with Zul'jin's name as a constant reference point, the warlord who had almost done it, who had come closer than anyone since Jintha, who had given everything, including his own son, for a war that ended with his death on the stones of the city he was trying to use as a launching pad. She also grew up with Zarama. Her mother was not Zul'jin. She was the woman who had survived what Zul'jin left behind, who had raised a child in a city without its Loa, who had held together the administrative structures of a tribe whose great leader had died and whose spiritual foundation had been cracked by that leader's own choices. Zarama's axe was an ordinary weapon by the standards that mattered in Amani warfare. No Loa blessing, no divine enhancement, nothing that the priest could point to as a mark of divine favor. It was a good axe maintained by a woman who knew how to take care of tools and how to use them when they were needed. For Zul'jarra, growing up between those two reference points, the grandfather's legacy of magnificent and catastrophic ambition, the mother's legacy of quiet and effective persistence, was a formation that shaped everything she would become. The Midnight Expansion, set in an era after the events of the War Within and the ongoing World Soul Saga, places Zul'Aman as a major zone, and the situation Zul'jarra inherits is one in which every bill that Zul'jin and Malakras left unpaid has come fully due. The Lo'o connection is gone, not weakened, not damaged, but absent. The animal spirits whose theft powered the Burning Crusade campaign never returned to Amani worships after they were freed. The ceremonies that had structured Amani's spiritual life for 16,000 years are still performed by priests who have lost touch with the beings they were designed to honor. Children are still initiated into the forms of worship their parents and grandparents practiced, but the divine attention those forms were designed to engage has been withdrawn. The Amani are a people whose gods have left them, not through the god's failure or death or departure from the world, but through the act of one generation of leadership that decided winning was more important than the relationship. The external situation is worse. Void invasion is targeting Zul'Aman specifically. The void, the force of absolute emptiness and anti-existence that represents the cosmos's most fundamental corruption, does not choose targets randomly. Zul'Aman, built on the bones of a sea thrax, standing above the buried remains of a servant of the old gods who served the Void Lords, is a site of genuine cosmological significance. The sea thrax that the ancient troll armies killed in the age of the Aqir War was a being connected to powers that have never fully released their interest in the mortal world. 16,000 years of Amani civilization built above it have not made those powers forget what lies beneath the city's foundations. The Void Lords, entities of pure anti-existence who exist outside the ordered universe and seek to consume it, operate through agents and corruption rather than through direct presence in the physical world. A Seathrax's buried remains are, in the cosmological framework of Warcraft lore, still connected to the powers that created and commanded it. Those connections are dormant, not severed. And Zul'Aman, sitting above that dormant connection for 16,000 years, is a door that the Void has always known exists. The Midnight Era is when they push on it. The uneasy peace between the Amani and the Blood Elves, the enemies who have been enemies for longer than either side can fully trace, is under additional strain from the Void pressure. Both peoples are standing in Zul'Aman, both facing the same existential threat, neither fully trusting the other, each carrying the full weight of a history that does not resolve cleanly into cooperative partnership. They share a common enemy. That has never been enough by itself to make them allies. The Blood Elves in this period are themselves changed significantly from what they were in the Burning Crusade era. The Sunwell has been repurified. The arcane addiction that defined the Blood Elf experience in the Third War's aftermath has been addressed, at least partially, through the Sunwell's restoration. Lorthamer Theron, who survived Zul'jin's interrogation, who became Regent Lord of a shattered kingdom, has guided his people through crises that would have destroyed most civilizations. He is a careful, experienced leader who has earned his authority the hard way. Standing in Zul'Aman beside the granddaughter of the man who tortured him, he is not the same lieutenant who was hauled into the Amani warlord's presence in chains. The geography of the conflict in the Midnight Era has a quality that neither side can easily ignore. Zul'Aman stands in the Ghostlands, which occupies the southern portion of the territory that was once Quel'Thalas, before the Scourge tore through it. The boundary between the dead-touched Ghostlands and the golden warmth of Eversong Woods to the north marks roughly where elven defensive capability collapsed during the Third War. To the Blood Elves, the Ghostlands are wound in their homeland, a constant reminder of the worst thing that ever happened to them. To the Amani, the same territory is the ancestral forest that the Highborne's arrival 6,000 years ago placed behind a barrier and declared off-limits. Two peoples standing in the same ruined landscape, each seeing a different catastrophe when they look at the blighted trees and pale light. The void threat does not care about this history. The force pressing on Zul'Aman from below and around does not distinguish between ancient Amani claim and elven occupation. It sees a site of cosmological significance, the buried sea thrax, the accumulated Loa power of 16,000 years of ceremonies, the ley line convergences that made the region valuable to the Highborne in the first place, and it applies pressure toward access. Zul'jarra and the Blood Elves present in the zone are, in this framing, obstacles between the void and what it wants, regardless of what they mean to each other. Neither is she the same kind of person her grandfather was. Zul'jarra's arc in this context involves being thrown from a mountain, a distinctly Amani method of testing whether someone has what it takes to lead, which is to say, it is survival-based, because the Amani do not have much patience for leadership theories that have not been tested under actual lethal conditions. It involves the question of the axe that Akilzon once gifted to an Amani champion, whether that gift can be reclaimed, whether the breach that Malakras created between the Amani and the eagle spirit can be repaired sufficiently to make the Loa's blessing accessible again to the bloodline that Zul'jin represented. Zul'jarra's answer to that question is the most pointed possible inheritance of her grandfather's legacy. She refuses the Loa's blessing, not because she does not want it, not because she does not understand its value, or because she is making a tactical calculation about divine power versus mortal ability. She refuses it because of what accepting it would mean: the continuation of a relationship on terms that the Amani have not earned back, the reach for divine assistance by a bloodline whose last 2 generations destroyed the covenant that should have made that assistance freely available. The weight of that refusal is enormous. To stand in the sanctum of the eagle spirit with Akilzon's presence finally accessible again after decades of the Loa's silence, and say, not like this, not yet, we have not earned this back. That requires a clarity about what the relationship between the Amani and their gods should be that Malakras never possessed, and that Zul'jin, in the end, sacrificed for the chance to win. Instead, she takes her mother Zarama's axe, the axe of the widow who raised the Amani after the disasters her husband and father-in-law created. No Loa blessing, no divine enhancement, no stolen power, no borrowed divinity, no shortcut through the relationship that was broken and has not been repaired. Just the tool of a woman who survived and led and held things together through nothing but her own will. It is, in its way, the exact opposite of every choice Zul'jin made. He reached for power over relationship. He took what could not be freely given. He burned the covenant for the chance to win. Zul'jarra chooses the relationship over the power, the mother's axe over the ancestor's legacy, the earned over the stolen. Whether this is enough, whether the Amani can rebuild their connection to the Loa from this starting point, whether Zul'jarra can lead her people through the void invasion with an unblessed weapon and a fractured people and a history that weighs on every decision she makes, the Midnight Expansion has not yet fully answered. The story is still unfolding, but the Amani are still in Zul'Aman. The city that was built on Kithix's bones is still standing. The people who built it, who have rebuilt it, after every catastrophe, who have refused to accept every version of defeat as permanent, they are still there. The version of Zul'jin's story that those who killed him and those who built their civilization on his people's land prefer to tell is straightforward. He was a savage raider. He was a torturer. He made choices that harmed his own people. He was defeated by heroes who stopped him from making those choices worse. His death was a resolution. The right side won. That version is not false. He did torture prisoners. He sliced open Lorthamar Theron's abdomen and painted the lieutenant's face with his own blood in an attempt to extract information about elven runestone positions. He conducted raids for decades that killed people who had no personal involvement in the decisions made by elven rulers 3,000 years before their birth. He allowed Malakras to steal the low essences in a way that severed his people's connection to their gods permanently, a wound that would still be felt by Zul'jarra's generation and possibly beyond. His final campaign involved prisoner sacrifice. He was not, in any simple moral accounting, a good person, but that version is also aggressively incomplete because it begins with the Second War and ignores everything that preceded it. The land of Quel'Thalas was Amani land before it was elven land. This is not a contested claim. It is documented in multiple sources: Zandalari records, troll oral tradition, and elven historical accounts that acknowledge straightforwardly that the Highborne arrived on territory already inhabited by the forest trolls. The elves built their civilization on Amani sacred sites. Silvermoon rose on the foundations of troll ruins. The Sunwell was established at a ley line nexus that ran through land the Amani considered among the most holy in their homeland. The Banadinoriel barrier was erected specifically to keep the Amani out of forests they had inhabited for thousands of years before the first elf arrived. None of this is what Zul'jin invented. None of it is what his people's anger distorted into something more dramatic than the facts warranted. It is simply what happened. He was born into that history. He did not choose his inheritance any more than anyone chooses the wound they are born next to. He chose what he did with it: the unification of the tribes, the raids, the alliance with Doomhammer, the refusal to accept the siege's abandonment, the decision to cut off his own arm rather than remain in chains. Those were choices he made, and they are his to own. But the foundational thing that drove all of those choices, the belief that the land was his people's and had been taken unjustly, and that this fact had not ceased to be true simply because a long time had passed, was not a delusion. It was history. He was the kind of enemy that makes you ask uncomfortable questions about the story you're being told, not because his methods were defensible. Many of them were not. Not because he was free of cruelty or above inflicting suffering. He was neither. But because the thing he was fighting for, examined honestly, was something that reasonable people looking at the facts without a vested interest in the current arrangement of the world would have to acknowledge had been unjustly taken. He faced that injustice with his whole life. He spent everything he had on it: his eye, his arm, his son, his people's relationship with their gods, every alliance that might have served him better with more flexibility, every moment of patience that might have been spent on something other than an ancient wound that the world had decided to stop calling a wound and start calling simply the way things are. He fell. His last words were, "Maybe me fall, but da Amani Empire never gonna die." He was right about that. Zul'jarra stands in Zul'Aman with her mother's axe. Zul'jan advises her. The Amani are still in the city built on the bones of the creature their ancestors killed 16,000 years ago. The void presses in from outside, and the blood elves maintain their uneasy proximity, and the Loa do not answer prayers the way they once did, and the history that was never settled is still not settled. But the Amani did not die with him. The empire that he spent his life trying to restore, in the form he meant it, never quite came to be. But the people did not end. The refusal did not end. The memory did not end. We never give up. We never forget. We never die. He was right about the last one, at least. In Revendreth, in a hidden crypt, behind a carpet accessible through a flickering candle, the soul that escaped Bwonsamdi's claim thinks about elves and carries its sinstone and waits for whatever process the Venthyr have planned for it. He is still there, still remembering, still in whatever sense applies to souls in the realm of the dead, refusing to let it go. He was a forest troll who was born into a 3,000-year-old wound and decided with his whole being to be the one who healed it. He failed. He paid more than he should have had to pay for the attempt. He made choices that made the failure worse than it needed to be. He left his granddaughter a legacy that is as much burden as it is inheritance. And the Amani are still there. That is the complete story of Zul'jin. If you found his life as morally complicated and as historically compelling as I do, hit like and subscribe. The full stories of Warcraft's most fascinating and contested figures are right here on World of Sleepcraft, and there is much more waiting for you.